Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. Just kidding. But we left off on chapter 7 on the Moccasin Trail. We just finished where Daniel, Sally, and the Rutledge family landed their raft. But when Johnny looked around, he saw that Jim and Daniel were not, So Johnny, Sally, and the Rutledge family landed their raft, and when Johnny looked around, he saw that Jim and Daniel weren't there. So we're starting on chapter 7, and I'm gonna read the whole chapter for you guys, so you can pause and play as you want. Okay, a couple of days later, Jim and Daniel scrambled down the steep embankment to the same rocky little beach, driving before them the skinny cattle, who lowed dispiritedly as they faced the churning river. They could be driven no farther on this side. The mountains were impassable, meaning that they couldn't pass them at all. They can't get through the mountains. An immigrant raft appeared around a bend, the men fighting wind, rocks, and hidden obstacles like demons. Had Johnny's raft passed yet? Both Jim and Daniel shouted questions as the vessel whirled by, but the wind tore their words to shreds. "What'll we do?" yelled Daniel finally over the thunder of the water. "Stock can't ford this." Jim shook his head. Nothing could ford this, certainly not these half-starved animals. They would have to ferry the beast across somehow or other, and it would cost them days of delay. The pemmican was already ominously low. "Jim?" He looked down into Daniel's anxious face. "I'll get you there," he repeated stubbornly. "Go get the hatchet out in my possibles. We're going to build another raft." It was 3 days before the last terrified animal was across the river. Mud-coated and exhausted, Jim and Daniel slept among tumbled boulders, and next morning strained upward again into the teeth of fresh snow. The trail on this side was rougher, steeper, more strewn with pitfalls than the one they had already come over, if that was possible. Only the dwindling food supply enabled Jim to distinguish one day from the next. As they struggled through a white and swirling world where they could see ahead only a few feet at a time, where the gusty wind drove the snowflakes into their sleeves and down their necks, stung tears into their eyes, and then froze them on their lashes. Every branch, every twig was laden and bent with snow, and the stumbling animals wore inch-thick caps and cloaks of white. But what worried Jim was the increasing weakness of himself and the boy. He had dared take no more than a few mouthfuls of food for several days now, and had cut even Daniel's rations by half. Surely they would reach the Cascades tomorrow, or the next day. How long could 50 miles be? But still the trail led on. Still the snow fell from the dirty sky. At last, one evening, as they halted for the night in a rough little clearing, Jim dug into his pouch to find only one small morsel of the pemmican left. I don't know if you guys remember, but pemmican is the dried meat covered in fat that Jim packed with himself, and he gave some to Johnny to pack for the raft too. His eyes went to Rutledge's half-starved little heifer, then away again. It outraged his pride to have to kill for food one of the very animals he had contracted to deliver safely. Automatically, he set about making camp, but there was a slow drowsiness about his motions. The air was deathly still this evening, and so cold his nostrils stuck together when he breathed. His fingers felt like wood, his feet like stumps. Clumsily, he dug a rude cave out of the side of the snowbank and motioned Daniel into it. The boy was groggy with fatigue and hunger. Well, from now on, it would have to be the moccasin soles, or that scrawny heifer, or something. He's talking about what they're going to eat next. So they're either going to eat the heifer, or they're going to eat their own moccasins. As Jim turned to pull Daniel's buffalo robe from his pack, the landscape seemed to lurch as he staggered, and the boy's voice, murmuring something about roast buffalo ribs, faded to a great distance. By gore, thought Jim, maybe I best start on them moccasins tonight. But he leaned against Bad Medicine's bony side for a moment, swallowing hard, and the lightheadedness passed. He tugged the robe free and flung it to Daniel, then tossed the last chunk of pemmican on top of it, a chunk no bigger than his thumb. "Ain't you eatin'?" asked Daniel sharply. "Not tonight." "Didn't eat last night neither," Daniel said. "Don't matter, I'm used to going empty." "For 2 or 3 days in a row? You're lying." "Shut up and eat your own," Jim growled. It was a momentous task to drag his own robe off Buckskin, to loosen her pack, to make his fingers move, to lift his arms. Daniel had become very still. "Jim," he faltered, "are we running out of food?" We got plenty. You're lying, Jim Keith. Daniel's voice rose, weak but shrill. It's getting low and you've been starving yourself so you can give it to me. Jim turned on him. Forget that and eat. I said I'd get you there, didn't I? An expression of stubbornness settled over Daniel's snub-nosed face. Not gonna eat unless you do. By gore, you eat that or I'll lay into ya. Go ahead, I still won't. Daniel lay back, his fists tight about the scrap of pemmican. Tears of weakness and protest spilled over. Panic touched Jim. He dropped to his knees beside the boy. Why won't you? I just won't. I can't. Cracky Jim, you wouldn't. We're brothers. Slowly, Jim sank back onto his heels. Yeah, brothers, he murmured. After a long, still moment, he reached for Daniel's chunk of pemmican and meticulously divided it into equal parts. It was then that Moki struggled into view through the breast-deep snow. From his mouth dangled the limp carcass of some small animal. Wait, Daniel, don't eat yet. Jim pushed both scraps of pemmican into the boy's hand. Moki, here. The dog growled deep in his throat. Moki, snarled Jim. The sight of the fresh, dark blood on the snow turned him savage with hunger. He rose slowly, letting the robe fall, and stepping past the wide-eyed Daniel. Moki retreated, his growls unmistakably hostile, his lifted lip revealing a row of wolfish sharp white teeth. Jim forced himself to halt. The dog stopped too. Slowly, Jim dragged his eyes away from the meat and turned aside. It took all his will. He stood there fighting to keep his head, waiting until he felt Moki's tenseness relax, and heard the growls die away. At the soft sound of slavering, he looked around. The dog's attention was now on the meat, which he was tearing as he held it with a forepaw. It stained the snow around it vivid red. Jim gathered his tired muscles. Soundlessly, with infinite caution, he began to approach. One foot was lifted with slow, elaborate care, but put down soundlessly. After a long, tense wait, the other. His jaws ached from clenching, and craving blurred his vision until the coveted meat seemed to dance crazily. But each step brought him nearer, and Moki did not know yet. When he was still 3 paces from the dog, he got a whiff of blood. It sent saliva flooding into his mouth, cracking his patience. He sprang. He heard Moki's yelp, felt a bright flash of pain as he seized the meat. The dog's jaws had closed on his hand. Under him, the hairy, steel-muscled body thrashed and clawed as they struggled together, filling the air with snow. Moki's savage snarls mingled with his own no less savage crow cursing. Gradually, he became aware that he was doing all he could, and it was not enough. The dog was stronger than he. For lack of the smallest margin of strength, he could have to watch his own dog eat while he starved. Fury sent strength to him from somewhere. The last spurt needed to force aside those flailing paws and sink his own teeth into Moki's ear. Hair filled his mouth. He bit down with all his strength, at the same time twisting his captured hand until the dog's head was forced into an unendurable angle. At last the trap-like jaws snapped open, freeing him and the meat he still clutched. He rolled clear and staggered to his feet, sending Moki sprawling with a cuff as he did so. As the dog tumbled away yelping, Jim grabbed for the branch of the low pine and clung there. He was crusted with snow, his knees sagged under him, his lungs ached. The struggle had all but finished him, but it was the strength itself he held now in his torn hand. Meat. Jim, you're bleeding, quavered Daniel. Jim lifted his hand. The wound was a nasty one. It don't matter. Don't be scared, Daniel. I'll fix it. He stumbled back through the trampled snow to the dugout, pausing to gasp a little insulting squaw over his shoulder at Moki. Then he fell down beside Daniel to examine his prize. It was far from his choice, a small and considerably chewed-up mink, its wet fur already freezing into stiff little points. But it was meat. He skinned it raggedly, his knife made unskilled by the trembling of his hands. Returning the 2 morsels of pemmican to his pouch, he gave Daniel a haunch of the mink and hacked off the other for himself. Chewing it ravenously, he felt warmth and life flow back into him. They'd get there now, heifer and all, with any luck. I just want to pause for a second and ask you guys how hungry you'd have to be to steal raw mink from your dog. Just think about that for a second. And for your dog to be so hungry that he's fighting you for it, when dogs are so loyal. By the time he had cracked the clean bone and sucked out the marrow, the scenery had stopped dancing and blurring before his eyes. Trees and snow-capped rocks were firmly anchored to the ground again. their outlines distinct, their shapes normal. He felt a surge of triumph as he began to bandage his throbbing hand with matted buffalo hair and a strip of buckskin. Jim Keith hadn't gone under yet, not by a long chalk. Turning at the sound of a soft whine, he watched Smokey slink closer, his plumed tail raising little clouds of snow as it thumped in apology. "Thought you'd keep it all for yourself, by Gore," Jim muttered. He glared at the dog a moment, then reached out to ruffle his ears and push his nose into the snow, finally tossing him the scrawny remainder of the mink. "Jim," said a small, tense voice at his side. He looked around to see Daniel still holding his piece of meat. "What's wrong? Eat." Daniel swallowed. I'm going to." Jim softened. "Poor kid," he thought. "It's rough doing for your first winter in the mountains. Anyway, you lay your sights, rough and small and lonesome." But all he said was, "We best save the pemmican. You guessed it. It's the last we got." Daniel's eyes met his for a moment. Then suddenly he stuffed the haunch into his mouth. He tore off a bite and chewed fast, his breath hard and uneven, but his young face stern. At last, he swallowed. "How was it?" said Jim. For answer, Daniel took another bite. Around it, he muttered, "Meat's meat." Jim grinned for the first time in days. "By Gory," he said, "I'll make a mountain man out of you yet." There was a long silence in which the darkness crept down over their still white world. Moki slipped through the dusk like a shadow and dropped down against Jim, who buried his fingers in the dog's ice-stiff hair. Scratching gently, he sat listening to the soft, desperate sounds of crunching and tearing as the cattle tried to make a meal of twigs and bark. "They say," finally came Daniel's small, yearning voice at his side, "they say the valley's same as paradise where we're headin'. Hardly ever snows there, nor freezes, nor nothin'. They say it's like spring all year round, with berries and nuts growing wild all over the place and game aplenty." He drew a deep breath and tossed away the mink bone, picking it clean. "I'm mighty anxious to get to that valley, Jim." Jim only grunted. He was anxious to get to the valley, too. He was more anxious than he cared to admit, just to get to the Cascades and find out if Jonathan and Sally were all right. They must be there by now if they'd made it at all. They must have been waiting for days. Maybe, he thought, they'll be gladder to see me this time if I get Daniel there safe. "Jim," Daniel said, Johnny don't think you mean to stay with us once we get settled. I heard him tell Sis. He thinks you're gonna claim the land and then go off again and live like you've been living. But you ain't gonna do that, are you?" And Jim found himself answering slowly, "No, I'm gonna stay." Daniel heaved a relieved sigh and snuggled against him. Brothers, Jim thought. He hesitated, then put his arms around the shivering child. After a while, his shoulder grew stiff, and one of his legs went to sleep, but he never moved throughout the long night. 2 days later, they reached the Cascades. It was none too soon. The cattle were skin and bones. Years ago, could it have been only yesterday? The brothers had eaten the tiny lump of pemmican, and since then there had been nothing. Jim's eyes had not focused properly for hours. He swayed with buckskin's every stumble, barely able to cling to her emaciated back. Daniel lay stretched along Bad Medicine's neck, strapped on with a length of rawhide. He had not yet reached the state of total weakness, thanks to the extra rations earlier on the journey. But it had been a task almost beyond Jim's strength to hoist him up that morning, and he knew they dared not risk a fall. Well, it was over now. The trail was descending, and he could hear the roar of the Cascades. Emerging from timber halfway down the last rock-strewn slope, he halted involuntarily at the chaotic sight below. Here at the brink of those falls, no vessel could navigate. The rafts had landed, and scattered immigrants gathered once more for the portage ahead. Over a jumble of rafts, wagon parts, baggage, milling people and animals, Jim could see a few sway-backed canvas tops already jolting over the hub-deep ruts that led westward through the mud. Where was the Keith's wagon, the Rutledges? How to find them in this shifting confusion? All the disasters he had pictured during the long 2 weeks flashed through his mind once more. Then Daniel pointed. "There's Sis," he croaked. "There's our wagon." There it was, with the big triangular stain on its canvas. Beside it, the blue splash of Sally's dress. Mud, cold, hunger ceased to matter. Daniel turned, a shapeless small bundle of bedraggled wrappings, incredibly dirty, but with the ghost of his old grin curving his cracked lips. "Let's surprise him," he said. He urged his mule down past the straggling cattle. Jim followed. It was no trick to hurry unnoticed through the jumble of wagons below and halt their tired mounts beside their own. Sally's back was to them. She was bent over a box, listlessly pulling out sodden garments and hanging them over the great wheel. Just think to yourself what the word sodden means from our vocabulary list. And if you forget, you can always look at your vocabulary list that I handed out to you guys. Her rag-bound feet were caked with mud. Her hair spilled untended over her drooping shoulders. Every move she made was heavy with fatigue. "Sis," quavered Daniel. She whirled. For an instant, she stood transfixed, her face twisting with such blinding, painful joy that Jim turned his eyes away. She gave one wild scream. "Johnny, come quick!" then stumbled forward, laughing, sobbing, flinging herself against Bad Medicine's side to seize as much of Daniel as she could reach. She pressed her cheek against his dirt-encrusted thigh. "Oh, Daniel, you're here! You're safe! You ain't dead! Johnny, he's come! He's come!" At that minute, Johnny hurtled white-faced around the end of the wagon, a hammer in one hand and a wagon tire in the other. At sight of Daniel, he dropped both and lunged forward. Eager hands tore at the thongs that lashed the boy to the mule. He was pulled down and hugged again and clung to. His voice rose shrill with weakness and excitement. "Cracky, sis, you still got pemmican? I'm most cavin' in. You oughta seen us. We ate raw mink meat. Moki hunted it and Jim fought him for it. Fought Moki. We ate it and I'm real hivernant now 'cause I wintered out, but we ain't had nothin' for a couple days," and Jim, unnoticed, stood silent beside Buckskin. Then Johnny turned. "Couple of days? Good criminy, looks like Jim ain't eaten for a month." "Fought Moki?" Sally cried. "My stars above, look at that filthy bandage. Johnny, run quick and borrow some chewing tobacco from Mr. Rutledge and I'll make a poultice." Jim was ashamed of the warmth that swept through him. Look at him standing there waiting and hoping for their attention like any squaw. Had it shown on his face? It was the impassive son of Scalp Necklace was followed them to the wagon and food. Later, when Jim had eaten, been doctored, slept, and was sitting beside the tall wagon wheel, eaten again, he heard Johnny's footsteps hard and eager coming up behind him. I'm going to pause there really quickly because I want you guys to notice Jim's used the word squaw at least twice now in this chapter, and both times have been used like a curse almost. So just take note of that, as that's how it's used. That's why I told you guys that it's a very offensive term. "Jim, Daniel says you told him you might stay on with us after we get the claim. Is that right?" Jim answered guardedly. "Oh, I reckon." "Criminy, you mean it?" "Sure. Got to winter somewheres." There was a pause before Jonathan said, "Oh." At the tone of his voice, Jim looked up, then rose quickly. "Wait, Johnny. I figure you to stay longer than just a winter if I'm wanted." "Wanted? Why, blasted, of course you're wanted." Sally, folded and repacking the soggy garments, was listening tensely to every word. It would suit her better, Jim knew, if he'd just sign that claim and get out. Well, he wasn't trying to suit her. "All right, I'm staying then," he told Johnny. He turned away and began to yank tight the drawstring on the bag of pemmican. Johnny strode off to finish mending his tire, murmuring, "We'll leave at daybreak. By golly, we're almost there." There remained only 5 miles of portage before they were through with the gorge. 5 miles! The worst miles of the 2,000 that stretched back to Missouri. From sunrise next day until well after dark they waded knee-deep in snow and mud and water, while the heavens continuously pelted them with more. Everyone was afoot now, and half of them barefooted. Daniel and Ned Rutledge walked first, driving the animals. The women followed, Maggie and her mother half carrying Bess, who appeared to be near collapse. So Bess doesn't seem to be doing very well. Sally stumbled beside them until she was hysterical with the pain of her tired and frozen feet. Jim swung her atop Bad Medicine, who wavered a moment and then staggered on. The reassembled wagons brought up the rear of the procession, Jonathan and Mr. Rutledge grimly forcing their oxen over an incredible trail in which the mud lay so deep that no one dared look behind for a fear of seeing the wagons overturned and lost forever. Yet other wagons had got through somehow. There was top-heavy shape only half glimpsing through the curtain of rain, rocking and swaying ahead of them right now, and more were following. The trick was to keep moving, not think or feel or hope or count the hours. And at last it was finished. The portage was made. The 5 miles were behind them. Soaked through and almost dead with cold, the two families crowded into their battered wagons and somehow fell into an exhausted slumber. It was more than a day later when they could gather strength to build the raft that would take them their last lap. But this time there was no fear in the parting as Daniel and Jim, on shore, shoved the raft free into the current. It was easy poling now, on into the valley, and the animals would find food in the descending hills. The gorge was licked. As they took the trail once more, Jim turned for a moment toward the vicious cleft which had so nearly succeeded in keeping them forever. Behind him, like a world infinitely far away, lay Powder River and Absaroka, the plains and Teos and Tom, all his old familiar haunts and his free-roaming life. He was cut off from all that now. Every mile of that snowbound trail rose a separate barrier. What was ahead? Uneasily, he fingered the medicine bundle tied to his braid. A glimpse of Daniel's bright head moving along the boulder-strewn trail reassured him a little, but before Jim followed, he fished a small bag of kinnick and a scrap of red cloth from his pouch, and hung them on a low branch as an offering to his helpers. Then he nudged Buckskin with his heels and headed west. West, to another reunion with Johnny and the others, at Fort Vancouver, where man and beast could rest a day or two, where the trail-weary immigrants replenished supplies on credit, had horses shod and wheels mended, or merely wandered about the huge stockade basking in the pale sunshine that was like heaven after the gorge, and staring at the bustling, well-fed people, blacksmiths, coopers, Hudson's Bay clerks in the black cloth coats, Indians, traders, galley-dressed voyagers. West and south, along the broad silver-gray Willamette, into a new land, a rain-misted valley lush with promise, each rise crested with timber, every hollow deep with grass. Good country, reflected Jim, as he held Buckskin to a walk beside the squealing wagon. A man could find food and clothing here a year in and year out, though he'd have to cross the mountains for buffalo if he wanted the best lodge skins. Oregon, place of plenty. The Shoshons called it. So they call Oregon the place of plenty. Just remember that, because it has so many resources there. Place of plenty. Clyde Burke, a spare middle-aged man from the next wagon back, spurred alongside Johnny to shout enthusiastic prophecies. Had Johnny noticed how rank the ferns grew, how many creeks there were? No droughts in this country, no sir. They'd all grow rich from wheat and lumber. Just wait a few years more and more people would come. There'd be sawmills, flour mills, villages, towns, great cities. Jim rode forward out of earshot and out of sight, consulting meanwhile the portion of his brain which was an accurate map of every peak, forest, canyon, watercourse, and ridge within 1,000 square miles. Another river should open out from this one, not far ahead, and westward along its banks a couple of miles was a place he and Tom had camped one night last summer. He was back in an hour or so, wheeling Buckskin in a flurry of tail and hooves beside the lumbering wagon. Place over westward, a piece might do ya, he told Johnny. Where? How far? Sally called down eagerly from the tall wagon seat. How's the water? Added Jonathan. It ain't fur. There's a creek and 2 springs, I think, and it's on a little river. I forget the name. On a river? Is there much timber to clear? No more'n anywhere else around here. Sally drew a long, tremulous breath. Sounds mighty good. Come on, then. An hour later, the wagon creaked into a little clearing lighted by the pale rays of sunshine now breaking through the clouds. The wheels slowed, made their final squealing revolution, and came to a halt under the towering oak tree. The oxen reached eagerly for the grass. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. There was the river, willow-edged and tranquil, filling the silence with low music. There were the dark firs rising yonder, just where one might build a cabin. Beyond lay gently rolling glades, a tangle of blackberry and hazel, a wooded hillside, a whole peaceful, untouched little valley drowsing there in the late afternoon sun, just waiting for the Keiths. Certainty and a deep content stole over Johnny. 5 long months of journeying were done. So Johnny and his family, so Johnny, Sally, Daniel, and the Rutledges, we know for sure that they've been on the road for 5 months and counting. Sally, he said. He looked up at her, sitting tense and straight beside Daniel under the weather-beaten arch of the old wagon top. Quite suddenly, his eyes were brimming with tears. Sally, come on and get down. We're home. You sure, Johnny? Well, ain't you? Sally drew a long, deep breath and came to her feet, pointing. I want to build the house right there in front of them big trees, and I want to plant them rose slips I brought yonder by the front door, and Mother's lilac. We can have a real table to eat off again, and real chairs and a fireplace. Cracky, yelled Daniel suddenly. Look at that fish jump. I bet that river's crawling with them. I'm gonna cut me a pole, by Cracky, I'm gonna. He scrambled to the ground, talking faster and faster, and Sally followed. The clearing rang now with their excitement, and weariness fell away like a discarded garment. It'll be just 1 room at first, Jonathan was saying. But we'll add on. And look, yonder's a good space for the garden, soon as I get it cleared some. Let's walk over that ridge and down to the glades. Jim says there's 2 springs and a creek. I bet the soils grow anything. Jim watched them hurry across the clearing, skirt the timber, and vanish over the ridge, then reappear a few moments later in the sunlit glades beyond. Daniel clambered up the slope for the river, yelling incoherently about 10-foot trout, and dashed after them. An impatient tug on the bridle aroused Jim. Buckskin was reaching for the lush grass. He slid off and let her have it. For a moment he stood still, breathing the clean, moist air and watching the breeze dance in the fir trees. Then he walked slowly down to the water's edge. Still waters, green pastures. Easing down on his haunches, he watched the minnows darting about in the clear brown shallows. Noted a longer, darker shadow that might be trout lurking there where the trailing branches of the willow stirred lazily in the current. Yonder up the bank was a trampled place where deer had sometimes come to drink, and there was a scarred tree, old beaver sign. Yes, it was a good place. They'd ruin it now, of course. They'd ruin the whole valley. Johnny and Rutledge and all those others cut down the forest and scare away the game and spread fields and houses and cattle and sheds and wagons and clotheslines over the whole face of this wild, beautiful country. Tame it and plow it and fill it with people. He listened to the soft running whisper of the river and remembered its whispering Indian name, the Tualatin. Then he rose abruptly, walked back up the bank, and began to unload his mule. And that finishes up chapter 7. I just want to talk to you guys really quickly about what Jim is feeling at this moment. Is he's seeming to feel happy about the fact that this land is going to become filled with people. Just think about that, brainstorm about that, because that's definitely going to be something I'm going to ask you guys to journal about when we get back. But before then, stay safe, like and subscribe if you really feel like it. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed and you're enjoying your time off. Bye!